Good morning and welcome to the COP Trust to continue the discussion on agricultural advantage, the case for climate action in agriculture. We want to thank all the sponsors, there are very many, who have facilitated the series of discussions that have been taking place for the last week here and will be continued today and tomorrow. I particularly want to welcome you all for coming this morning. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you to a session that says the breeding advantage. And within that session, we want to discuss in particularly tapping into genetic diversity for food security in a 4 degrees world. Now that's kind of a little shocking statement because didn't we all agree 2 degrees world? I want to start saying just a few words, personal words. Earlier this year in May, I was traveling from a research station, Maize in Morocco, with a friend and colleague who is also a renowned scientist. We had just visited 100 hectares and saw what was growing, and we told this all was doing quite well with less than 300 millimeters of rain. As we were driving towards Rabat, I learned that only 10 years ago, that region had predictable rain of about 600 to 700 millimeters a year, rarely an exception. I was both shocked and encouraged. Shocked because 10 years isn't that long, and see your rainfall decline, your heat index rising, and the rainfall become much less reliable is an enormous challenge. Encouraged because we saw fields that, at least on a research station, did very well. So there is hope, and there is an enormous amount of rethinking, because what we have to do now, if we talk about the breeding advantage and tapping into a 4 degree world, then we have to really anticipate what could happen in the next 10 years. There's a lot of information out there, but I think the challenge ahead of us is still to find out how we respond to these challenges in terms of breeding. Can we continue to do incremental breeding as we might have been doing over the last 20, 30 years? Or is there a big systemic shift that is needed? So I'm very happy and pleased and honored to introduce a distinguished panel for our discussion today. Because, of course, we have high expectations that we want to see what they have to suggest to see what we might be doing in the next 10 to 15 years. Our first speaker will be Charlotte Lusty, who works at the COP Trust and has spent her career in biodiversity and conservation of genetic material. She oversees the CGR gene banks and leads the program that is funded for that purpose. Our second speaker will be Andy Jervis. He spends his life to protect ecosystem services, which is probably going to be one of our greatest challenge as we try to adapt to the 4 degree world. Every drop of water counts. Every bit of soil matters. Our third speaker will be Thomas Maia, who is a senior advisor at the Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Consumer Protection at the German Ministry. And he will tell us a little bit about the international treaty and perhaps a bit about the complex system of intellectual property rights. And finally, the conclusion will get a policy angle by Ali Abu Sabah, who is the Director General of ICADA and brings to it a long background in development work, project and policy with the African Development Bank, very familiar with the territory where most of us work. Thank you very much, and I won't say more, and I would like to I have forgotten to mention our dear moderator, Mr. Luigi Guarino. He is leading the science team at the Crop Trust, and I think he is a very old hand, and everything genetic. Thank you, Luigi. I'm sorry. Charlotte, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually just stepped off a plane from Fiji, so I'm in the bizarre situation of finding Fiji is already here in Bonn. And I actually wear my Fijian flower, which is the way people, male, female, of all ages, all have this behind their ear looking very elegant, but I'm just wearing it here for now. I don't feel too elegant today. Right, so I'm going to talk to you about gene banks and their role in climate change. And as Margaret was telling us, agriculture must transform over the next 30 years in order for us to avoid mass famine. Basically, 60% increased production is needed to keep up with the increase in world population figures. If that production is to happen, there must also be an adaptation of our crops to the abiotic stresses that they're experiencing and the increasing incidence and spread of pests and diseases, amongst other things. And as well as all of that, agriculture has a responsibility to reduce the emissions that they're producing. Current levels of 19% estimated or more of total greenhouse gases coming from agriculture must come down. To make this transformation happen, plant genetic resources very much underpin the possibilities that there are for changing agriculture, and they affect every aspect of agricultural systems, from the state of soil and the management of water to the state of ecosystems, the ability to deal with pests and diseases and their resilience and to increase yield. So plant genetic resources are behind them all, whether at a system level, whether we're talking about diverse agricultural systems or whether we're talking about diverse species within those systems, or whether we're talking about diversity within the species, so diversity of varieties. All of these layers of diversity of plant genetic resources are very important to our future existence. And coming back from Fiji, one of the crops we were talking about there and is very important to those populations existing over a vast geographical area there in the Pacific is a crop like coconut. Very important to them, very resilient in the face of cyclones and climate change and rising sea levels, producing an important level of protection to the coastlines and to the ecosystems, and bringing income to very poor, marginalized smallholder farmers. So here is a key crop where that plays a role, a very important role in the future of our agriculture. And perhaps more familiar is the story of breeding and how we're able to build new, improved varieties that have traits that can deal with climate change. This is a key source of hope for the future. And one of the important sources of those traits come from crop wild relatives. In fact, a great deal of work has already been done to integrate the traits that we find in the wild species that are related to crops, conveying a large number of different and important traits to improve varieties, particularly where wild relatives in centres of diversity have had a long experience of battling well-known pests and pathogens within those centres of diversity and can now convey those traits into improved varieties. And this is where we come to gene banks, because it is in gene banks that we are able to conserve and research and develop better understanding of these plant genetic resources. And right now, as I'm standing here now, I can say we don't really know the full value of what we are conserving in those gene banks. But equally, we don't know the extent of the challenges we will face. What we do know is that gene banks provide us options. many options for how we move forward. And equally as important as the actual facilities, the physical seeds in the gene banks, is the system within which we're working. No one country is self-sufficient in genetic resources. It depends completely on a layer of collaboration across continents and across countries. And this exists in the International Plant Treaty. We will hear more from Thomas Maia about that. In a multilateral system of access and benefit sharing. It exists in international gene banks that are able to reach very high standards of operation and ensure that materials are held in the long term. It also exists equally in the same centres being able to put in place very high levels of phytosanitary controls so that we do not spread pests and diseases. And equally in the information systems that are shared across countries so that we know what are in these gene banks. So we're very much dependent on there being a global system of collaboration and coordination here. And what I want to tell you specifically about is the gene bank platform that is developed within the CGIAR in the 11 centres that have a responsibility to manage these resources for the international community. And these are located in various developing countries, mostly in the centres of crop diversity of the crops that they care and manage for. And in this gene bank platform, we are targeting target 2.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly with an aim to maintain the genetic diversity and increase the levels of genetic diversity of seeds and cultivated plants held in those gene banks, and importantly, promoting their use and promoting access and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from those genetic resources. And a core part of our work is very, well, you could almost call it routine. It's very much putting in place the kinds of operations that will ensure that none of these seeds lose viability or are lost from the collections. Many of them date back many decades, collected from farmers' fields back in the 60s and the 70s. And these are, in many cases, these gene banks that are the only places you can still find these seeds. So there is a large amount of work involved in ensuring that they are safe and healthy and free of pests and diseases and available for distribution. And indeed, the CG centres are busily providing genetic resources upon request, dealing with more than 2,000 requests every year, distributing more than 100,000 samples annually to more than 100 countries worldwide. And their numbers of accessions in these gene banks, as you see here, around 750,000 accessions, mostly in the form of seed, but also in the form of tissue culture for certain roots and tubers and bananas that do not have seeds that are held viably in storage, and a large collection of plants and trees that are held in the field. These collections are becoming more and more used and more relevant. They have increased distribution levels by something like twofold over the last decade. And we can expect that increase to continue as we get to know the genes and their expression and the traits that they convey within these materials. And there is a vastly improved capability to use these traits and integrate them into improved varieties. And I have to emphasize also, this is a picture from Lebanon, from the Akada gene bank. And as Margaret was saying, they have managed to do a tremendous job of gathering not only the materials from the region and looking after them, but in the face of the disaster that they faced in Syria, they were able to rescue their collection. It was all conserved in the Svalbard seed vault, and they have returned to Lebanon and Morocco and replanted out their collections and put them back in storage. So there is a level of security within this global system that is really almost infallible. And I think, as Margaret was saying, they managed to plant these seeds out in difficult conditions where there had been less rain, very much less rain than normal, and still these seeds are viable, and this is very much our genetic heritage from a long time ago, being in very safe hands in Ikada. Similarly, we have a situation here in SIP where the communities around and about had actually discovered that they'd lost quite a number of their potato varieties that they remembered vaguely from childhood. And the gene bank there, the CGIR gene bank, the International Potato Center based in Lima, were able to dig into their collection and find those varieties and repatriate them to the communities. So we have very real examples of how these gene banks show their security, show their availability of resources, and are acting very much in the way and means that we hope to see them carry on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Charlotte. That was a great segue into what I'm going to talk about. So I'm Andy Jarvis. I work for the CCAFS program on issues around climate-smart agriculture and the kind of practices and technologies that are needed to adapt to the climate challenges. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the transition from what are these genetic resources, what's their relevance then in the climate problem, and what different initiatives are doing in terms of the breeding side of things. So I don't have a nice flower, I'm afraid. I didn't get that memo to do that. So, oh, here we go, a lovely flower. I'm going to go ahead with that. Okay, so first of all, just why breeding? What are we thinking about here? The first reason that has kind of been, this has been an issue for several decades now of kind of crop improvement, is just to feed a growing population. We have two things changing. One is a growing population, and second is changing consumption patterns. So we do need to be producing more food into the future. And all of that within a context of climate change. And so this is IPCC data, and it's showing pretty much any crop that you look at, you see moving forwards to 2050, a trend with increases in temperature of reduced yields. And so climate generally is, many crops are at their limits in terms of temperatures right now. When temperatures especially go above 30 degrees, you see this drop-off of yield. And so that is happening for a number of crops, and especially in tropical regions where you're already at these high temperatures. So you're seeing here in wheat and maize pretty significant reductions with a 4-degree world as in the context of this discussion. So big challenges going forward. We've done analysis of kind of asking the question, well, when these impacts start happening, it's gradual, but are there kind of, is it non-linear? Are there thresholds where we suddenly see major drop-offs? And so the question we started with is, well, when are these impacts going to really be felt? And so we went across a whole bunch of staple crops of Africa, for example, here looking at the date at which you see these crops becoming non-viable in these regions. So take an area in Africa, and what we were asking is, well, if they're growing right now, yams, for example, in what year or what decade is yam no longer going to be suitable? And you see different cases for different crops, and it's kind of visualized here. You can see some crops pretty resistant. Many roots and tubers are resistant to climate as it advances. They have kind of built-in resistance to high temperatures, drought issues. Other crops much more sensitive. And so especially coming out from this has been the issue of kind of maize and beans coming out as priority crops for action, where impacts are starting to happen not kind of later in the century, but actually within the next couple of decades, you can see large areas transforming. So just to look at it in detail on beans, you can see many areas here. The areas in red are areas where we're seeing loss of cropping area. So these are areas where it'll become unviable to grow beans into the future. And so some of those impacts are happening not kind of 50 years down the line, but 20 years down the line. And so we're approaching kind of the point where these regions have to transform in their cropping systems, unless we take some serious action in terms of adaptation. Likewise for maize, there are certain areas, very important cropping areas for maize across Africa, where also we're seeing it going over those tipping points. So this is the context we're working. Pretty negative impacts, pretty alarming statistics in terms of impacts over the next, in the short term, 20 years, as well as in the kind of through the century. So this seminar is a little bit about kind of looking at the breeding advantage. So what can crop breeding do within this kind of climate adaptation sphere? And so can we breed ourselves out of the problem? And so there's been a number of people have kind of looked at this in terms of can we increase, for example, production to be able to feed the growing population? And this is without necessarily taking into account climate change. The current trajectory of yield increases that we've enjoyed over the last 40 years since the Green Revolution is kind of steadily been going up, but still, if you kind of extrapolate out at current levels, it's just not going to get us to where we need to be. And so we do need to kind of look at new ways of increasing this, what they call genetic gain, so yield increases significantly going up. Now, one of the challenges is that breeding's not like something where we're gonna produce a new variety of crop and we'll release it next year. That's not the way it works. This is long lead times. So the average kind of crop breeding process can take, this is an example in bananas of taking 17 years to even getting close to kind of a distribution of new materials. And so, we're talking multi-decade investments. And so you need to start now if you're going to breed for technologies that are going to help, for example, Africa in the next 20 years' time. So you need to be starting now. So it's a long process. So the kind of the way a lot of centers, research centers have been going about this is kind of first of all looking at, well, what are the challenges out there? What are the types of abiotic traits? What are the climate challenges that are going to face a crop? And so this is an example in beans across Africa. And so there we ask the question, well, what is the climate factor that will most hold back productivity in beans in the next 20 years? And so here you can see areas, it's a mixed bag. It's not always just heat and drought, but in the case of beans, you have large areas with heat issues, heat challenges, large areas with drought things, but also excess waterlogging and things like that can actually spur on all sorts of pest and disease issues. So first of all, it's the priority setting of what do we need to breed for. It's setting up the infrastructure to be able to test and breed for that. So this is, for example, this is a greenhouse in Ciat in Colombia where we can raise temperatures by 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees within the greenhouse, and then evaluate materials under a kind of future climate. So it's a means of kind of simulating the future. And so then we go to the genetic resources that Charlotte has spoken about and look for traits and look for the kinds of characteristics that are going to be desirable into the future. So this is then kind of just an example of this is again sticking with the bean example. You have the primary kind of gene pool, which is the Phaseolus vulgaris. That's the crop, the species that is cropped to common bean across the world. That's where you might find materials. But also you have kind of wild relatives. And so you have secondary gene pool, which is, there's a number of species there that generally come from the humid and subhumid areas. And often you find there characteristics with pest disease resistance, vigorous rooting that can be useful, also as a drought adaptation option. And then you can go into the tertiary gene pool where you see these other species that where we're identifying a lot of the heat and the drought resistance. So you go looking for these characteristics and integrating them into your crop. So just a few examples of some of the success stories. One is the El Nino bean. We call it the El Nino bean. This was you're not just kind of breeding for a kind of future average climate of increased temperature, but also looking at climate variability. So El Nino hits many parts of the world. In Colombia, it hits El Nino means drought and heat. And so we did a whole process kind of selecting from these materials and identified a bean that during an El Nino event is going to be much more adapted to conditions. And so this was really just selection, but it was pulled from one of the species that is in that tertiary gene pool, across with one of those species. Drought-tolerant maize, and so this has been for CIMMYT, a kind of flagship project program over the last 10, 15 years. And so they're having already massive impacts across Africa in terms of adoption of drought-tolerant maize. And this is really kind of pushing the boundary of what maize can tolerate. And also they've been looking now moving into heat-tolerant maize as well. And so this combination of these has great potential into the future for adaptation. Another important aspect of all of this is the participatory plant breeding side of things. So one thing is kind of in the lab, the kind of development of these technologies in research centers, but also getting out and looking at bringing farmers' preferences into this process. And so this is an example here from beans in Africa, where it's generally a woman's crop, and you're looking at varietal testing and selection based on some of the traits that farmers themselves are looking for. And you see men value traits like yield and market value, whereas women are also looking at things like short cooking time. So you have to bring all of this into these aspects of farmer preferences into the process. And so the final point I'll just make is Charlotte mentioned kind of crop wild relatives and their importance. This is some work actually that we did from over 20 years ago almost. But this was using, as we get looking for these different traits, you go further and further away from the crops themselves, looking at their wild relatives for these traits. And this is an example of, in peanuts, where there was a new variety developed, and it was really the crossing of 3 wild relatives into the crop gene pool. And actually one of the challenges of this is the wild relatives themselves are not well collected, and they're also threatened themselves by climate change. And so of those 3 wild relatives, there's actually one of those is kind of confirmed extinct in the wild. And so this is also a big challenge, is getting those wild relatives into gene banks. So just to segue into the next presentation, I mean, the need for materials, the thirst for these kinds of materials for crop adaptation is pretty high. And so you've got kind of crops coming from all over the world. And as Charlotte mentioned, this interdependent world where we've got a globalized kind of food system, cropping systems. And so we need an enabling environment on the policy side of things for these materials to be available and usable in breeding programs. So at that, I'll end and hand over to Thomas. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Thomas Maia. I'm from the German Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And I thank you very much for that bridge, in fact, because that's where I would start my presentation from, this hopefully enabling environment for exchange of genetic resources. Here we go. I think I don't have to repeat, you're all familiar with these basic facts that PGRFA, plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, are key for our future food security. We have a long history of this interregional and even international exchange of these resources, and as just has been shown by these on these slides, there's this high interdependence between countries nowadays. This is just an example of coffee, how it traveled around the world in different times, and it was bred here and brought somewhere else and developed further on. So that's where we are today. We have all this interconnection globally, more or less. That was, of course, realized, recognized some time ago already, and it was again confirmed in Sustainable Development Goal 2, we already saw in your slide, saying that by 2020 we have to maintain genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, and so on. So when I said it was recognized some time ago, it was already even before, but I think one of the major steps was 72 in the UN conference when they said we have to build up an international program to preserve world's genetic resources. And in 1983, the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture was established, one of the key bodies, I would say, globally to coordinate this work. And maybe, I guess most of you here will know these products from the Commission, which are the global plans of actions for plant, animal, forestry, fish, which lay out, in fact, the basic agenda for our work in this field. Now, back that time, when the Commission was founded, for example, 83, we had this concept of genetic resources being a common heritage. So it was, as I said, it was exchanged throughout the world, so it was everybody's more or less heritage. And exchange should be as free as possible to further boost breeding and to really make use of these fantastic possibilities we just heard about breeding. But then somehow the concept shifted because people realized that if we want to conserve something, you have to give it a value. So they thought, okay, if a country has rights over these resources, it may feel more responsibility or more use of really conserving that, because then it has your value and you can use it later on more as a market product. And that was when this idea is then enshrined in the Convention on Biological Diversity, 93, when they said, okay, states have sovereign rights over their resources. Now that is a bit of a shift now. In that conference, they already agreed that this is not something you could really base on if you're working in agriculture and with genetic resources for food and agriculture. So therefore, they tasked, in fact, FAO to negotiate an instrument which helps to keep this free exchange of material. And that was then eventually in 2001 adopted the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, ITP-GRFA. That was agreed 2001, and in 2007, a basic instrument, this multilateral system we heard about before as well, was established by the creation of a standard material transfer agreement, which I will come to in a minute. Nowadays, we have about 143 contracting parties. That's quite a lot. And recently, the United States of America joined, so one of the big players in genetic resources as well. I have to check. No, this one. This one. Yeah. Time-wise, the Nagoya Protocol was much later. That is, in fact, the instrument which was created under the CBD to have this bilateral exchange. The treaty was much earlier, as I said, 2001. Nevertheless, I compared these two just to show you the difference between those two approaches. Under the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, you have this bilateral approach where every user has to negotiate bilaterally with the providing country terms and conditions of access and of exchange. And this is, of course, quite a challenge maybe, and therefore this multilateral system where you have standardized terms of exchange is the one which we prefer for food and agriculture. That is as well recognized under the Nagoya Protocol, especially pointing at the special characteristics of these genetic resources. Now, what's the scope of the treaty? It is all plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. That's quite a lot. Includes crop wild relatives. Not always clear boundaries, but that's how it's stated in the treaty. And that's where we are. Then within that system, comprising all plant genetic resources, we have created this multilateral system of access and benefit sharing that says, okay, sovereign countries have their sovereign rights, but in that sovereignty, they agree to build up this multilateral system where they give all their, let's say, agree on certain conditions to have this access to PGRFA and to share benefits. It consists of 64 crops. They are much more PGRFA, but 64 is the major content, which are about 80% of our food from plants. Now this multilateral system then is supposed to create something like a virtual, oh, I see there's some German on this slide. Sorry for that. But the basic idea is you have this multilateral system which creates this virtual gene bank where all the 64 crops are in and the accessions of contracting parties which are under their management and control. This is a practical example. This is our German website where you can go through search. So it's our contribution to that MLS. If you look for German material, you will find it here. And I guess there's an English version for that website as well. No, what's the outcome? It's about 1.7 million accessions are documented in that system. We saw some numbers before. These are a bit different, but more or less the same magnitude. About 47,000 standard material transfer agreements have been used since 2007. And that's up to between 600 and 800 transfers of genetic material per day. Here you can see statistics from January last year, but these are the general numbers where these material went to which countries, to which regions, in fact, FAO regions. Now, I was mostly speaking until now about this exchange of material, but of course there is this conservation sustainable use aspect as well that is more or less guaranteed through this exchange, because exchange means use, but there's as well the component of benefit sharing. Basic idea is given here on this rather complicated slide, but I would only focus on, is there some pointer? Here. So this is the material where you are working with if you are still in the breeding process, and once something gets out of that and gets on the market, the company, whoever, has to pay a small amount of its sales to something which is called benefit sharing fund, and from that multilateral fund the money will go to different uses. It is of course not only the money which is the benefit sharing, it is also all kinds of other possibilities like exchange of information, technology transfer, capacity building, these kind which are in the CBD as well mentioned. This sharing of commercial income so far has been rather limited, close to zero, in fact zero. What has been flown into the benefit sharing fund are voluntary contributions from contracting parties, which are about $20 million US since 2010, I think. How this money is used is given some examples on this slide for all kinds of projects, setting up regional plans, giving into farmers' fields, community seed banks and all this stuff. Breeding programs as well. So quite a lot has been done and quite a lot of farmers have been reached, but you can always say it could be more benefit sharing. Could be more. So what are the next steps in this whole, in the treaty context? As I said, oops, sorry, I'll come back. Here's this one. Said 20 million of voluntary contributions so far, but no contributions from commercial income. So therefore the governing body, the treaty, decided to set up a process where, whereby this benefit sharing mechanism can be improved to get a better system, to get income from breeders to the benefit sharing system. And on the other hand, to expand the MLS, it is 64 crops, I said 80% of food, but some major crops like soybean, for example, are still missing. Some underutilized crops are missing. So now it's a two-sided process, once increasing the benefit sharing, and on the other hand, in expanding the coverage, the crop coverage of the treaty. And I think with that, that's all from my side. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And I think I have the privilege of building on the past few presentations who have actually laid the ground very nicely for what I intend to speak to you about today. My name is Abu Saba, Ali Abu Saba. I'm the Director General of ICARDA, and I'm on the job for almost a few days, 1 year and a few days, just a few days. And when I look at the title of the presentation, I remember my first conversation with the Deputy Director General of Research, a very capable individual, Dr. Andrew Noble, during the first couple of weeks of our conversation when I started this, because they are actually living the situation of a region that is moving very quickly into a 4-degree world. So, ICARDA has put in place a strategy that is going to guide our work for the next 10 years. That would basically try to reorient our research programs around this very quickly approaching climate scenario. And that will build very strongly on the achievement of the organization over the past 40 years. And we will not focus only on the crop improvement dimension, but rather we will focus on greater integration among the work that we do in ICARDA, focusing on the crop improvement, but also the water agenda, the livestock and small ruminants, and greater integration among the different programs so that you're able to bring in resilience. Now, there is a World Bank report that predicts a chance, 40% chance of exceeding a 4-degree warmer world by the end of the century, even a 10% chance of exceeding even a 5-degree by the end of the century. In the region where ICARDA is operating, we are seeing evidence of that. Kuwait in 2010 registered the highest temperatures recorded in history, 53.7 degrees, and you can imagine how hot that environment is, but also to be followed by the next highest recorded temperature, 53.7. And that has serious implications in the region as a whole, both in terms of variation of rainfall, more unpredictable weather patterns, and even the growing seasons are shifting. So with these kind of things, and bearing in mind the increased projected population by at least doubling by the year 2050, it basically shows you the complexity of the problem that in the region where we work. Now, this map attempts to show the implication of this potentially hotter climate in the region where we serve, and the greatest impact clearly shows and is visible in the area of mean precipitation, but also temperatures. Now, for a 4-degree region, warmer region, ICARDA works with partner centers from within the CGIAR, but also very strongly and very closely with the national research partners in the regions where we're active. And the thrust of our work is basically to try and help advance research on crop improvement to produce high value and climate resilient crops, crop improvements for yield potential, but also for biotic and abiotic stresses, greater integration between the livestock, the rangelands, the crops, and the production systems. That by itself increases the ability, the resilience of the people living in those regions to be able to withstand and sustain those negative impacts of the climate, intensification and diversification of cropping systems, of course, protected agriculture, especially within the Gulf areas and West Asia, under a more constrained water environment. Some instances, and where in some instances, it will become probably the only way for those people to be able to produce crops. Improvement in water availability and management, including recycling of water, and of course, value addition on dairy product. It is important to know that at some point in time, agriculture will not even be an option. So it is equally important as we look into the limits of how far we can stretch those things, is for us to also look at alternative livelihoods, so that the ultimate idea is to help those populations. Now, you've heard a lot about the gene banks, and ICARDA has one of those very active gene banks where we have significant collections from those 4 key non-tropical dryland agrobiodiversity sources or centers, 155,000 accessions in the key commodities where ICARDA has the global mandate: barley, wheat, chickpea, fava bean, lentil, and a few others. Of course, one very important value of the collections we have is the wild relatives that is heavily used in the crop improvement programs. In making the selections, we have developed what is known to be the focused identification of germplasm strategy, and it's a technique to really look at the linkages between the environment and the traits you're seeking into the kind of crop you want to breed for. And through the application of this technique, you're able to do a much more focused selection of the kind of genetic resource you would use in your own breeding programs. Our pre-breeding work largely occurs in Morocco and Lebanon, where we draw heavily on the wealth of genetic resource that is available to us. Now, one of the things that is new that we are doing in the new strategy is promotion of the research programs on the farming with alternative pollinators. This has a potential to significantly improve income, and ICARDA, by the way, is the only CGE center that is currently working on this pollinator protection. One program that shows the collaborative efforts that we do across with other CGIAR centers is the collaboration program with CIMMYT around the One Global Wheat program, where we have the opportunity to we use field testing genotyping to be able to work in many of the regions, and I think so far we have very, very encouraging results in the initial year of the program so far. We are also using our presence and our partnership within the region to disseminate and increase the uptake of technologies that are being produced. We are active in 12 countries in Africa, where the work that we have done on heat-prone and disease-prone variety ecologies has enabled a significant amount of, for instance, wheat production in countries that are not known traditionally in growing wheat, such as Nigeria and Sudan. Under these very, very hot environments, it has been possible with the support and the research outcomes of the work we do in ICARDA. In Southwest Asia, we are working on developing new varieties of lentil that is possible to do to harvest mechanically, and this is increasingly becoming very useful, especially within the context of using the small window of opportunity with rice fallows, where almost 15 million hectares of land are left fallow, and ICARDA work in the development of these new varieties is making it possible for farmers to actually exploit that. Barley is again one key crop that ICARDA believes strongly will be the future will be the future crop in the region under increasingly hotter climates, and you will see from this slide that trends in the work that we do in barley has been decreasing, and because of the huge potential that this offers, both in terms of human food, but also animal feed, as well as the industrial applications, we believe we're going to be scaling out our work in barley, and of course funding of this work continues to be a problem. I think overall you could see that the region is facing real threats under an increasingly warming climate. ICARDA is already preparing for this future in a multi-sectoral approach by greater integration of the research programs we do. ICARDA cannot provide all the solutions alone. ICARDA has to work with other CGIAR centers to bring in knowledge and expertise from across the world to complement and augment the capacity and the ability of us to provide solutions to the national research partners, which is really a unique model through which ICARDA operates. We also need to look beyond the possibility of agriculture being the main source of livelihood by looking at alternative sources of livelihoods. So in this area, our collaboration with organizations such as IFPRI and many of the other national partners becomes a very critical and very important partnership. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I ask all the speakers to come up to the front, please? And so we have about half an hour or so for questions and answers from both the audience here, the live audience, and also from the online audience. So I hope you've got lots of questions for all our panelists. Okay, so we're all set. So, while waiting for the audience from the audience and questions from the audience, both online and live, maybe I can start off by asking Andy one question that occurred to me while listening to your talk. You talked about showing areas in Africa where beans and maize will become unviable. But how do you make the link back to the gene bank? How do you find material that could help you to solve those problems amongst the 750,000 or accessions in the CG centers or 7.2 million worldwide? How do you make that link?
Okay, I mean, the first thing is that, I mean, the gene banks have thousands and thousands of collections there, and as Charlotte kind of said, it provides options, right? You know, in the last 20 years, heat and drought tolerance has kind of become a key variable you're looking for. But in most cases, the gene banks could, you know, have thousands of these collections that haven't actually been screened for it. So the first thing is screening for these kinds of traits. I mean, I showed the example of the bean one. It was almost by accident that they spotted. In that case, it was actually a wild relative going even further beyond the collection into the wild relatives of beans, that they found the kind of origins of heat tolerance in beans. So it was going to a wild relative. And so it's really, I mean, it's a question right now of, this is why it takes a long time, because it's not that easy to find the traits and make the crosses and get them into cultivars that farmers like and will adopt and grow. So it is a long process, but it starts by the screening across the gene bank, and crop wild relatives are becoming a lot more important for that, because we've mined a lot of the kind of opportunities from the crop gene pools.
Thank you very much. Yes, we had a question here.
To the same presentation, you showed a slide on participatory plant breeding, but then within the slide you talked about that the farmers help you in participatory variety selection. Is it the one or the other?
Both. I mean, I think it's very important if you're going to achieve adoption, and under the multiple kind of factors that a farmer is choosing or looking for, the traits that a farmer is looking for to grow a crop, then it's very important that they're involved in the process of selection. And so I think, you know, that can increase your adoption. I mean, I think we wrote a paper a little bit about what potential is there from crop improvement to address climate. And one of the conclusions was that you can't throw any approach out the window, from you know, the biotechnology in the lab through to the kind of very participatory work down on the ground with the farmers, it's all needed actually to address the huge challenge. And right now we're not keeping up with climate with crop improvement. So we do need to throw new approaches at it.
The question was more related to, because
Microphone.
everybody is doing a participatory variety selection, even the multinationals. But so the question, to what degree to involve the farmers in the breeding process? So is it really participatory plant breeding, which means that even in segregating populations the farmers help to select, or is it really to work in the more finished products and do the variety selection to see whether they have farmer acceptance?
I still stick. I mean, it depends, and it's kind of both of those things. You know, I think you need to cross through the breeding spectrum, and it depends on the crop as well. I mean, it's been participatory varietal selection in beans, for example, in Africa has been hugely successful as an approach. In other crops, it might be more difficult. It really depends on the system.
Well, I guess the bottom line is that don't throw anything out the window. I mean, any approach has its value in the appropriate context. You had a question here?
Yes. One question is to anybody on the panel. We talked a lot about yields and crop improvement. What yields at what price? What other resources have to go into estimating the yield increase and perhaps shifting from maximum to optimal? Which leads me to my second question. If no more beans in the many African countries that you have shown, what comes next? And what do we have to look for now in our gene banks in order to initiate the search for the next? And the third question would be, how helpful is the treaty in all of this, the exchange of material?
Okay, let's take one question at a time. Maybe the first one is directed maybe at you, Ali. Maybe you can say something.
I think it's important to recognize from a research perspective, the focus is on maximizing productivity out of water. Now, from a policy decision and implementation, each country makes their own decision. We have seen very clear examples in Saudi Arabia when they wanted to grow wheat and wanted to become self-sufficient, and great investments in water and center pivots. That was not at all maximization of the maximization of production for the kind of water that they were extracting, which brought in long-term negative impacts in terms of the drop in water levels. So I think this is a question of policy at country level. They will the value of research is that we provide the options, we provide the evidence, and then hopefully through advocacy we're able to influence some of those decisions. Related to this, maybe the very first point about selection, allow me just to come back with a very interesting story on this. I was visiting Kuwait a couple of months ago, and I was looking at some of the new work that they're doing on palm dates and the tissue culture. And they told me that after the Iraq-Kuwaiti war, after some of those palm trees continued to be standing and producing. So there was a natural selection. You go there and you collect those, and then that's an opportunity for you really to look into what are the very unique traits that something like this offers. And I think there are many examples. I mean, in science, some of those things do happen and provide excellent opportunity for the scientists to build on. I hope I covered at least the first couple of them.
Yes, and maybe on the second one, on what happens after beans, or maybe Charlotte, you can say something.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are other options, and you have other crops, obviously, that can deal with the kinds of temperatures that beans can't deal with, cowpea, for instance. So as you move into, as environments change, other crops from other environments that were previously warmer, they're able to learn lessons from the different and changing environments. So there are lots and lots of options, and as long as we get to understand better how crops behave in different temperatures, different growing seasons, different challenges, the more we can use the different options that we have available.
And a follow-up question might be, how do you know what those options are? And for that, I would point you to the genesis system which brings together information on genetic resources collections around the world, and is part of the treaty's global information system. And speaking of the treaty, there was a question there also to Thomas. To what extent is the treaty really helping all this?
I think you direct that question to me because I talked about the treaty.
Yes.
In fact, it should be more directed to the colleagues who use the treaty because they are the ones who do the daily work. From my perspective, it is very helpful for the exchange of material amongst the CG centers, for sure, because they base their exchange on those rules. When it comes to material which is in national gene banks, of course, it is the question how the contracting parties, national authorities, really make use of the possibilities in the treaty. I think we in Germany make all the material of the treaty available. We use it quite a lot, even for internal exchange. I think it holds for Europe as well. So it depends on the contracting parties how much they do. And I think one important aspect is, as you just mentioned, the GLIS, the Global Information System, which is built up by the treaty, and that, I think, is in the crop trust together. So that is something which is very important, I would say, for future use.
Oh, lots of interaction amongst the panel. Yes, please.
I think you touched on a very important topic, because currently we have a system that works well. The gene bank platform, the crop trust, those gene banks, and the treaty that regulates how some of those process issues should happen. So I think this is really a good example that we should build on and use more effective. My personal view, and I'm not expert on breeding in any sort, in any way, that we have not yet discovered the limits of what we can do. Okay. And I think there is still enormous potential. And of course that requires additional investments. But I think this is something yet to be exploited. Thank you.
And Charlotte, you wanted to also?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I mean, we've had direct experience of the treaty working, and I think there's been a decade where materials were no longer moving. But if we launched a project here at the Crop Trust to support national gene banks to regenerate their materials and put them in safe duplication, and we worked with some 88 national partners who were very ready to sign up to the standard material transfer agreement and work within the conditions of the treaty. So it worked very much as a safe and understood mechanism that allowed countries that hadn't been exchanging material and institutes that hadn't been working together as well. It gave them the vehicle to move forward and to exchange in a way that hadn't been seen for some 10 years. And I think that will continue to improve as people do see the benefits.
I mean, just to say, I mean, I think when we started with the CCAS program, the treaty was always seen as kind of one of the critical enabling policies for adaptation. Because if you think about a world 2, 3, or 4 degrees warmer, for a country to find the materials that it needs to adapt to that, the higher you go, when you go to 4 degrees, those materials aren't in that country. So climate change is increasing this interdependency. So for Tanzania to adapt, it needs to be looking at other countries' materials. But likewise, that other country needs to be looking somewhere else. And so it's a case of everybody benefiting from sharing, because everybody is in the same boat in terms of the adaptation challenge.
Yeah, and that's not anecdotal, is it? I mean, we do have studies that quantify that, the increase in interdependence. Yeah. And Hannes, yes, you had some. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm actually, just a personal view, I'm quite scared after all these presentations, and especially the presentation from Ali Abu Sabah. I mean, we're right next to the building where they're discussing reaching the 2-degree target, but as you pointed out, a 4-degree warmer world could be a possibility, and it has grave implications. And as you showed, that needs sort of transformational changes from agriculture, some really deep structural changes. And to me, some of these efforts seem to be rather incremental. I mean, Andy, you pointed out breeding 4 degrees, but I'm just personally scared and wondering, can we achieve transformational change that is necessary to meet food security, as you had in your slide, Andy, as well? So just trying to think, what is the reality? Is there a tipping point?
Okay. What does transformational change look like?
Well, I think maybe first I would not be alarmed or scared. I would actually be comforted that we are starting now to look at the solutions. I think it's all about statistics. I think what you have seen in the presentation is 40% chance of something occurring by the end of the century. 40%, maybe around 4 degrees, maybe even 10% could take us to 5. That's important for us to see from a science perspective. You have to recognize we're not here sitting in the negotiations room where there are certain boundaries that could influence how decisions are being made. Here we're looking purely from a science perspective. And science should not be constrained. I think we should have the liberty in science to look at possibilities, chances, and then for us to really work on what could be the potential solutions. Whether you use a solution or not is a different matter. But I think there is generally clear evidence that the world is warming up. The limits is a scientific exercise or a practical exercise. We're yet to see all of those things. What we're doing here is we're using the options that are offered by those gene banks, the research programs collectively of the CGIAR centers to look at what could be the options for those things. If it happens, then the options will be there. You spoke about the alternative. I think we have seen some instances where people today can no longer do farming. They moved into solar energy, the existing farms, but they did not have to migrate. There was no forced migration, simply because they had an alternative for them to continue the livelihood. And when you look at the socioeconomic components of most of the programs that we undertake research on, you have this integration that should also not rule out this possibility and provide those alternative options in case they happen. I'm sure there might be many other options, but I'm just citing you one example.
And maybe if I can just add, I mean, if you, let's be optimistic and say we agree on a 2-degree target and achieve it, right? But 2 degrees, let's say, would have, what, 40 years or so to reach that 2-degree increase. And in 40 years with breeding, if you look at the kind of the current rate of gain in terms of heat tolerance and some of the issues of drought tolerance, we've done analysis on maize in Africa, and it's barely keeping up with the rate of change of climate. So I mean, I personally think it's something where there's been very little attention in the adaptation community at the importance of investment in breeding. But I think it's one of your very critical tools in terms of adapting, having those technologies. So it does need greater investment. I think it needs a higher profile kind of from a climate finance standpoint. This is a very, very solid kind of technology to future-proof against the 2-degree world.
And even in a 2-degree world, right, there could be places with 4 degrees increases, and why throw them under the bus?
And 2 degrees in agriculture is huge, right?
Yeah. Sorry, yes, Masa?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Margaret, the introduction, and for panel speakers. And all of you made a point very clear that we are facing with a major challenge. And that I congratulate all speakers. But one thing that I felt a bit missing is nutritional concern. When you talk about food security, it's almost equal to calorie. And the food is not just calorie. And just role of gene banks and breeding. It's not only for more food calorie production in spite of increased temperature, but provide better nutrition for current and future generation. And by having not just genetic diversity, intraspecific diversity, but taking advantage of interspecific diversities, we can address many problems. And as Charlotte mentioned, that if common beans, phosphorus does not work, we may switch to biguna, cowpea. So we need to look at a much wider scale of how we deploy short-term and long-term biodiversity to make our diet healthier and ecosystem itself healthier. perhaps theme of today's meeting is breeding and looking into future scenario. But I feel that we should recognize even now we have a major problem.
Yeah.
Even before looking at the scary future of 2010.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then what we can do now, and also looking into future, not only food calorie, but diet, nutrition.
Absolutely.
And there you can see a value of your crops, like a legume, fava bean, lentil, and so on. Where currently 60% of our food calorie comes from only 3 grains.
Yes.
So just I like to make a comment that value of gene banks and breeding is not just food production.
Absolutely.
In terms of calorie.
Can we allow Dr. Michael Baum, Director of the Crop Improvement? I mean, because that's really at the heart. Nutrition is at the heart of what we do in terms of crop.
Sure, we can do that. You would like to answer that? So the question was, you know, are breeders focusing too much just on yield?
Definitely not, because you know, for instance, in the CG between the centers, the big program on nutritional security. For instance, Mr. Ali Abu Sabah, he mentioned the example of targeting legume species for South Asia. Most of our legume species, especially lentils and chickpeas, are subjected to a program for increased iron and breeding. And so there were varieties that we deploy there that with a short duration to fit in the rice fallow rotation also have an increased concentration on iron and zinc, and very important component for South Asia to improve nutritional security. But across the CG there are also other programs looking at other nutritional factors. So it's not only iron and zinc, it's short cookability and lots of different traits that are looked at, and of course that maybe are not the focus of these presentations, but it is being considered and being taken care of.
Okay.
There's something of emerging kind of concern is also there's growing evidence that with increased CO2 levels in the air, nutritional quality of crops is also going down. And so this is kind of almost there's so little known about this one, but something that definitely needs a bit more attention.
Did anybody want to? Yeah. All right. Yes.
I have two quick questions. The first one is they're both sort of on the question of urgency. And the first one is we've just had a treaty governing body meeting a couple of weeks ago in Kigali in Rwanda, and I was wondering to what extent the urgency of climate change features in those discussions, and what happened? Does that make the treaty community come together and sort of more lead to more concerted action than we've seen in the past? This is my first question. The second question was for sort of major shifts, we really need more investment, I think, as Andy had mentioned, in breeding programs. But what we see around the world is a concerted disinvestment in public breeding, especially. And there's this notion out there that the private sector will just pick it up, which I think is safe to say is not happening because the private sector works on very different incentives. So I was wondering whether the panel could comment on both those questions.
All right, Thomas, you were in Kigali and you were party to the negotiations, of course. Would you like to kind of give a brief summary of what happened and gauge the atmosphere of the meeting?
Yes, of course. I mean, you were there as well, so.
Yeah, but I wasn't privy to all the discussions behind closed doors.
Oh, I guess that's why you are smiling. I think there's still this two diverging views which you have between, let's say, CBD people and treaty people, whereas the I would say more bilateral thinking people put more emphasis on this benefit sharing aspect of the whole complex, whereas others put more on the access side. And I mean, we have to be fair. experience from the last, what we have 10 years now, with no benefit sharing from commercial benefits, of course, is not really a sign that this system is functioning. There are good explanations for that. You have only benefit sharing, commercial benefit sharing, if you have protected varieties. Mostly patent protected, and so far the country using mostly patents, like the US, were not on board, so they entered only now. So all the varieties we developed here with treaty material are without benefit sharing, without monetary benefit sharing to the benefit sharing fund, to be exact. So there is some kind of discontent in parts of the world saying, okay, we gave access and now we don't get enough back. I showed these 20 millions which have been put into that benefit sharing fund, which have been spread around the world, but this is still something which is not really satisfactory to all contracting parties, I would say. So this was a critical point now, because we are in the negotiations for 4 years now to enhance the functioning of this system, and this governing body was, from my perspective, quite disappointing, to be honest, because we didn't really move forward. We agreed to go on negotiating. So let's see what happens in the next 2 years. Okay, the question is, did the contracting parties feel the urgency? I would say yes, they feel, but they have different approaches to deal with that. Some say, okay, we have to speed up access, we have to facilitate that access to exchange more material. And others say, yeah, fair enough, but then we need better benefit sharing. And that's the discussion we are still in.
And what about, who would like to say something about the role of the private sector in all this? I think for somebody in one of the presentations, for example, there was something about the drought-resistant maize for Africa. That's a public-private partnership. There are others in breeding. Would somebody like to say something about the role of private sector in some of these, in the breeding advantage?
Victor.
Oh, Victor would like to say that.
A bit of experience on the CIMMYT side. So you've got some positive experiences where private sector joins a club, puts a little bit of money in, and they do research together, or they have early access to research. That works. When it comes to the realities with the treaty, you've got both, for example, a company with B. They just talk to CIMMYT to offer certain traits on an SMTA basis. And then you have the exact opposite. And another company starts with M, and they would never dream of using SMTA. Yeah. Overall, I would say it's not been helpful in terms of accessing genetic material for public sector need. That will be our assessment right now. And I'm sure that assessment is shared by IRI, my guess, SIAT as well. Yeah?
So what would need to change, do you think?
Oh, excuse me, the people that are here on the panel. I was waiting for a little bit of transformational suggestions here. And I mean, there's a big elephant in the room that we've not talked about, and that is that we've got all the gene banks and the data, we've got the breeders, and in most cases they're not connected, and we've not done a good enough job on this score. And I was hoping for some transformational ideas here, and that's our job here, International Agricultural Research. That's what we should be focusing on, making a difference.
Let's see if we can get some transformational ideas about linking gene banks and farmers. Who's got?
I don't have transformational idea per se, but I mean, coming from outside the system, I see a lot of opportunities that has not been tapped yet about potential public-private partnership. And I think the stumbling block so far continues to be the whole issue about perceptions and regulation. So I think there is a need to urgently invest in new forms of partnerships that brings greater benefits to the CGIAR and possibly gene banks, the crop trusts and others, that would allow us a reasonable share of the benefits so that you're able to continue to invest in upstream and public research. I think purely public good service to continue the way it was many years ago when public funding was at adequate level is not justified anymore. And if the system is expected to continue to do its core duties, it is absolutely important we look at new ways of partnering with the private sector in a manner that brings in greater benefit to the system.
And I mean, I just add that I think we need to make a good business case of why crop improvement is actually very, very attractive to climate finance. The challenge is that in 3 years, in 4 years, you're not going to have necessarily a huge result. But in in 20 years, the cost benefit of investing in breeding is going to be absolutely phenomenally big in terms of climate adaptation. And so if we can make that argument a lot better and develop those business cases, I think then that's connecting these two worlds that are not necessarily talking. And it's the same happens in the policy side of things. The treaty is probably the best adaptation policy out there that in COP23 it's hardly ever talked about. And so it's really about connecting these two. And so I think we as a community need to get better at that.
Of course, we also need to highlight that the private sector is really not interested in a lot of our self-pollinating crops. I mean, private sector might be interested in maize and in soya, but in lot of crops like wheat and rice and legumes, so far they are not investing because they don't see the possibility and the opportunity to make money. So that's why that's also not going to change in 10 years or 20 years time with or without climate change. So unless we have hybrids, but we don't not necessarily want to go that route to make it more complicated than it is. So for the crops, our crops, rice and wheat and others that are self-pollinating crops, we will continue to rely in future on public funding unless we invent other models that make it attractive for the private sector to invest. Now, where the private sector engaged to cross-pollinating crops like maize, yes, with the current legislation that we have, there are difficulties because for many years to come with an SMTA, there are problems with patenting and ownerships, and so that's why even for those crops, the private sector is reluctant to engage into the public-private partnerships. So unless I'm also not an expert in the legislation, but if you want to make it more amenable for investment by the private sector, so we need to look into the legislation that is available to encourage investment by the private sector.
Okay, we don't have to draw this to a close, but I think there was one final perhaps question. Oh no, there's another. I think no. Oh, 3 questions. Okay, all right. You don't want a 4th one? Okay, please.
So a question for the panel. We have Harvest Plus that has mainstreamed all the biofortification in certain crops. Are there any efforts for having like a Harvest Plus for traits for climate change, for breeding, like drought resistance, heat resistance, etc.?
So a dedicated
Let's do it.
CCAP. Who would like to tackle that?
Well, I see a hand there. I'm not aware of any at the moment, but I'm sure Michael may share some more insights.
Yes, at least in principle. So there's a consortium called HEDWIG, Heat and Drought, to deal with issues as heat and drought. So there was a group of, 150 scientists meeting in Frankfurt 2 years ago to discuss principle of such a consortium, specifically looking into heat and drought. And so that is headed by a number of people like Peter Langridge from Australia, Matthew Reynolds from CIMMYT, and I think at the moment it's in the stage of looking for donors to get initial funding. And so similarly like Harvest Plus, should be a program that runs for 5 years or 10 years in order to but basically all the physiologists, breeders for main crops are involved in this initiative, and at the moment we're looking for funders to invest in such a program that again is in the public hand.
And let's give the last question to Margaret here.
Breeding, being a beneficiary of public breeding, privatizing whatever they use out of the public breeding for private use, whether we lead that discussion at the right level. My question to the panel at large would be, I think what we discussed today here, I'm sure the private sector discusses all the time too. I mean, if we sit here and say 4 of the biggest crops that are being grown today are potentially at risk in many parts of the world, what is perhaps called an orphan crop today may not be an orphan crop tomorrow. And I would thought in the past. So taking this more at the strategic level rather than the legislative level or the treaty and regular level would of course shift the dialogue also to different people. But I wonder whether this is something the group has ever thought about, even if it's just over lunch in the cafeteria, how to get out of this idea and what kind of ideas may have emerged from it.
So moving to other crops. So the future belongs to sorghum and millets.
And barley.
And barley. Yeah. Yeah. Would anybody like to have one final word on that?
I can.
As long as it's not Michael, because he's spoken quite a lot on this.
I can start. I can start. I think these are the kind of things you need to elevate the level of advocacy at a different level. I think we need to leverage things such as the G20 conversations, some of the major multilateral banks coming together and discussing the future of food security in the world, leveraging organizations like FAO, IFAD, because the dialogue has to go few steps higher, not just one step higher. It has to go few steps higher. And one good thing, I think, collectively at the CGIAR, the recent meeting, we've, for instance, agreed on to have an ambassador for resource mobilization, ambassador for the system, someone who can knock on the doors of presidents of countries and foreign ministers. It's no longer about the level of DGs or their staff accessing the usual channels for funding. Someone like Maize, former president of IFAD. So the level of conversation for this transformation to happen has to really go to higher levels. Now, of course, these are still things that are yet to be seen in action and in practice.
And we have to bring this to a close, but let me say in closing that we have an opportunity to take it to a higher level at the final of these, the series of side events on the agricultural advantage. We've talked about gender, policy, agronomy, low emissions, business and breeding. And the final wrap-up session is tomorrow at 1 p.m., 1 to 5 p.m. at the German Development Institute, where we hope to take it to a higher level and to wrap up and this discussion on making the case for agriculture action on climate change. Thank you very much, both to the audience here and online, and see you tomorrow. Bye.